Hello and welcome to FINA H101 Art Appreciation, being presented by Indiana University, Purdue University of Fort Wayne. This is our Week 7 lecture. Our topic for this week is the figure, that is, representations of people or of the human body. We're going to be investigating how the figure has been portrayed in different times and places. Now the next slide you're going to see is going to have a few quotes that I want you to read, and I'm also going to give you a few definitions and terms. So without any further ado, let's move on to our first slide. So please take a moment to read these quotes by Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. This is from his book called The Poetics. So please pause the video if you need to, and make note of these quotes from him. I would like to also use this slide to give you some definitions of terms that we're going to be using. We're going to be talking about idealization. Now, idealization means the representation of people and or objects according to a standard of beauty. Then we want to consider the term realism, which is the representation of people or objects as they appear in real life. And then there's caricature, exaggerating by means of ludicrous distortion. So keep these terms in mind and read these quotes. And in your notes, you're going to want to sort of ask yourself the question and be considering that Aristotle, whose quotes you're reading here, was an ancient Greek philosopher. According to these definitions, these terms I've just given you, which of his quotes best describes realism? Which one of these quotes best describes idealization? And which one of these quotes best describes caricature? So try to put them together in your notes, and then we'll move on to how we want to apply these terms. Following our quotes from the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, we'll begin our study of the figures with some ancient Greek sculpture. Now, Aristotle lived and wrote the quotes you just read during the 300s BCE, so even to him, all of these artworks would have been antique from the past. Nonetheless, he probably would have been familiar with these types of sculptures from these different times. The first one, on the left, dates to about 530 BCE. The sculpture in the middle dates to about 480 BCE, and the sculpture on the right dates to about 450. So we're looking at a progression in time over the course of about 100 years, and you can consider that 3 or 4 generations. You can see that during that time, there were significant developments in how the Greeks depicted the human figure. Now, according to Aristotle's definitions and your own perspectives, which one of these seems to you to be the most idealized or the most realistic? Another term that's useful to think about with these images is naturalism. Naturalism refers to representing something as it would appear in nature. An artist trying to achieve naturalism wants to make a stone statue or painted picture look as lifelike as possible. Lifelikeness, by the way, is a representation of a person or figure in a way that captures how they looked in life. This is typically achieved through an accurate, detailed rendering of the person. One more term that comes up when we look at Greek sculpture is something called contrapposto, which is defined as a body posture where one's weight is distributed onto one foot, resulting in an S-shaped curve in the spine or torso. So if you have a statue displaying contrapposto, one foot will be engaged. All or most of the weight will be shown shifted onto it. And the other foot will be what we call free. That is, it has very little weight on it, and it's not really necessarily for balance. If you would kick the free foot, the figure wouldn't fall over. Now I'd like you to take a look at these sculptures. And I know they're in various broken states over the centuries. They've broken. But following the lines of the legs at least, and looking at the torso, think about contrapposto, and which one of these figures seems to display contrapposto best. So really take a look at that. And another way to think about contrapposto is in a very practical sense. If you're standing up, just shift all of your weight so you're on one foot, and you can sort of kick your free foot back and forth without falling over. Now, as you do that, and do it right now, just stand up in front of your computer and stand on one foot and feel how your body has to shift. For your body to stay upright in that position, your hips have to move a certain way, your shoulders have to move a certain way. That's all going to twist your spine ever so slightly to create that contrapposto. Now there's one of these figures we're looking on the screen that really has no contrapposto at all. Two other figures have contrapposto, but one has it a little bit more than the other. So I'm probably giving away too much when I say that. But take note of that in these figures. Which ones have the use of contrapposto and which ones do not. Once again, we have here several examples of male figures sculpted in stone, representing a progression of artistic styles from the medieval period to the Renaissance. So the one on the far left is the earliest one from the medieval period, and as you go across to the right, to the far right, you see a Renaissance figure. Now consider how you would describe these figures using the terms we've been discussing so far: realistic, naturalistic, lifelike, and contrapposto. Can you see an evolution across the centuries here? And really think about how you would describe these in the same ways that we did last time. Also, consider the idea of caricature. As I said in the beginning, caricature is an exaggeration of natural appearances by means of ludicrous distortion. Though that said, caricature can be a useful tool for artistic expression because it allows artists to represent ideas and character traits that can't necessarily be communicated with a strict adherence to natural appearance. As you look at these sculptures of the male figure, can you observe any instances where you think caricature has come into play? And so take a look at these. Do any one of these seem ludicrously distorted to you? And how so? And consider what the artist might have been trying to do with that. Figures can be represented in two-dimensional art, such as paintings, drawings, and mosaic, as well as three-dimensional art, such as the sculptures we've been looking at. This painting, by Poussin, St. John on Patmos from 1614, was created just after the Renaissance during the Baroque period. Now you might remember from previous lectures that the Baroque period had art that was usually very dramatic with high contrast between light and dark, had contorted bodies and heavy emotion. But not all artwork of the period fits that description. This work by Poussin is an example of what we call academic painting. That is a tradition of painting in which a group of artists and their works strictly follow or conform to the rules, tastes, styles, and standards of an established authority. The academic tradition is a related term, and that's when an artist conforms to the traditions of an official academy or an authoritative body such as the government, royal household, or church. Academic painting and academic tradition are usually conservative. They tend to carry on the traditions of the previous generation and are not what we would consider innovative or following popular new styles. So rather than picking up on the characteristic trends of Baroque art employed by many of his contemporaries, the tradition that this artist, Poussin, is following is this academic painting. Still incorporates the ideas of ancient Greek and Roman beauty that were popular in the Renaissance. So I'd like you in your notes on this piece to comment on how Poussin has kept the Renaissance ideal of Greek and Roman art alive in this painting. Now it might help to think a bit about the relationship of the figure to the landscape. What is around him? What might he be doing in this place? What's going on in the painting? How do we understand the figure differently if the painting was just a close-up of his face? Also, while most of the canvas is taken up with images of the landscape, how does the artist still focus your attention on the figure? So St. John here is a very small figure in the lower part of the painting, and yet Poussin is giving us subtle little indications to try to draw our eye to him. How is he doing that? Finally, do you think the non-emotional, non-Baroque academic tradition that Poussin paints in is well suited to this kind of scene and what Poussin is trying to do? So as always, just as a reminder in any of our lectures, feel free to pause the video, really look at the piece, and jot down some ideas, jot down some notes on this. Neoclassicism is a European art movement of the 1700s and 1800s that continued the same Renaissance-inspired Greek and Roman ideals. Neoclassical paintings typically depicted figures and scenes from ancient history and mythology, and aimed to tone down the extreme expressions of visual drama and emotion that became popular following the Renaissance through the use of symmetry, geometrically organized compositions, and clear, linear definitions of form. This neoclassical painting by Jacques-Louis David is called The Death of Socrates and dates from about 1787. Here we see a scene of ancient Greek history. Socrates was a Greek philosopher who was condemned to death or exile for his radical teaching methods and antagonism of Athenian political structures. Socrates rejected the option of exile, which meant he would have been able to live freely but in a far, far away place, and he chose instead death by drinking poison hemlock. He apparently was unafraid of dying and continued to lecture and teach up until the very end. So Socrates is the figure sitting upright on the bed with his hand pointing in the air. He's reaching forward for the cup that will poison him, and right up to his very last breath, he's lecturing and trying to teach his followers. So looking at this painting, can you tell what part of the story is being depicted? And well, I've already told you which figure is Socrates, but what else sets him apart? What seems to be happening around him? As we look at the figures around him, how they're positioned, what is the attitude of those figures? And how do those figures help to show you whether this is a good moment or a bad moment, pleasant or unpleasant, dramatic or mundane? How is Socrates being presented here? Is he being presented as somehow heroic or a villain? Certainly the Athenian government saw him as a bad guy. They wanted to execute him. But how does Jacques-Louis David, how does the painter represent him here? So again, jot down some ideas. Consider how David is presenting this scene. In this slide, we see representations of the human figure in a variety of materials, done from a variety of time periods and cultural traditions. On the left is an ancient Egyptian torso. Next to it is a gilded late Gothic sculpture of the Virgin Mary and Jesus, then an ancient Roman sculpture in marble, and on the right is a late Renaissance or Mannerist sculpture done in bronze. As I hope you're beginning to observe, naturalism and realism are relative terms. Depictions of human figures might be idealized or caricatured in some ways, while strictly adhering to naturalism in others. These variations arise not because artists were unskilled or unable to represent figures realistically. It's simply because mimicking nature does not always fulfill the artistic goals and cultural function of art that a particular artist is going for. Also, many cultures have different understandings of how so-called realism might be represented. Now, with that in mind, consider what you find most lifelike about each sculpted form that we see. How do you think the artist's different priorities and purposes are reflected in their artistic choices? Were different elements of naturalism considered more important across the styles, and how can you tell? Although styles and motivations for art change, one consistent tendency across art history is the desire of artists to innovate and change and improve the artistic trends and choices of their predecessors. As I mentioned, the sculpture on the right presents Mannerism, which is a style of art popular during the later part of the Renaissance, from about 1520 to the 1580s, which displays a rejection of naturalism in favor of artificial exaggerations and elongated, elegant form. Knowing that Renaissance artists were extremely concerned with Greek and Roman ideas of naturalism, why do you think Mannerists might have chosen to represent figures in this way instead? So again, based on what you've read and what we've seen so far, jot down some ideas on this. This is another example of Mannerist art. Parmigianino's Madonna with the Long Neck. The title is not the original one, but is a kind of nickname that developed over the years because of the way this artist exaggerated the length of the Virgin Mary's neck. Now, what other aspects of natural appearance do you see him exaggerate here, both in the central figure of Mary and the others featured in the painting? Do you think by elongating certain proportions that he is rejecting Mary's beauty, or trying to emphasize and enhance it? What might be his reasons for making the artistic choice, and what other clues in the painting might lead you to that conclusion? So really look at this piece, because there's some very interesting distortion going on here. Now we want to consider that our artist here is an Italian artist in a Roman Catholic area, and so Mary's an extremely important figure. So what do you think he's trying to do with this very obvious distortion of the figure here? This is a painting also intended to depict a beautiful woman. This is called Odalisque, and it's painted in 1814 by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. I'd like you to consider how you would describe and respond to the human figure being represented here. Do you think she's rendered naturalistically, as a caricature, or is she idealized? Does your first impression differ from what you think after you spend some time examining the details of the painting? As you describe her, and really take time to really look and really describe what you're seeing here, as you decide, be sure to take a good look at the length of her dramatically curved spine. She's got to have at least a few extra vertebrae in there. Also take a look at the background of the scene. How do the accessories around her add to the realistic or idealized effect of the painting overall? So jot down your initial response, and then really look closely at how he's distorting the figure, and then consider what that consideration does for your response to the figure. These two sculptures give us a good example of the relativity of artistic realism in sculpture. The example on the left is a Greek sculpture of a veiled dancer from the Hellenistic period. Dating from about 323 to 146 BCE, this is an era in ancient Greek tradition of art dating that prioritized the representation of dynamic movement and emotion rather than static idealized form. On the right is a statue from the Baroque tradition, a 17th century art movement that we've discussed in detail previously. So both of these sculptures have similar goals to show emotions and movement in their depictions of the human form. Is it possible for us to determine which looks more realistic? And I'm not talking about whether it's realistic that a figure has wings, but by looking at the faces and the bodies, which of these seems more realistic to you, and why? How would you describe these figures? Is one better at depiction of motion than the other? So consider that, what these artists are doing in these pieces. With the exception of one Egyptian statue, the art we've looked at so far this week has been European in origin. These three statues are from India, and show progression in the development of the figure in Indian art from the beginning of the Common Era to the 20th century. Although the first two depict women and the contemporary example is male, what features or characteristics do we see across all of these pieces that might suggest characteristic Indian ideals of figural beauty? What is similar and what is different in the depiction of this figure over 2,000-year period, and how are they similar and different both individually and as a group to the European works we've been looking at? What about the Indian tradition has the contemporary artist kept, and what has the artist changed? So I'm asking a lot here. I'm asking you to consider the progression of style in Indian figural representation over the course of about 2,000 years. How has it changed? How has it been modified? And also compare it to what we've seen so far in the progression of the human figure in European art. So jot down some ideas on this, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Lastly, we'll look at two examples of the human figure from African sculptural traditions. On the left is an Asante fertility figure created in Ghana around the 19th to 20th century, and on the right is a Dogon mother and child sculpture created in Mali during the 14th century. As we've seen throughout this week's lesson, naturalism is not the only aim in making figural images. Artists might choose to represent the figure in more or less naturalistic ways to tend towards idealization or caricature, depending on the expressive purpose and understood function of the art in their particular culture and time period. For these African artists, the symbolic interpretation of the human form was a higher priority and more honored artistic goal than simply copying naturalistic form. The artists of these two sculptures, though separated by distinct cultural traditions and several centuries of time, have both chosen to focus on figures of female fertility. Now I'd like you to consider what aspects of the human form you see being symbolically emphasized here. Why do you think that might be? What do you think the artist's goals were in the representation of the human figure, and how might this reflect the cultural function of these artifacts? Finally, we are often taught in Western culture to evaluate the success or beauty of art representing the human figure in accordance with its mimicry of natural likeness, in other words, with how realistic it is. Do you think a figure needs to be naturalistic to be lifelike or to have lifelike qualities? Do you think these African sculptures represent life and human experience? Why might the artists have chosen not to represent the figures naturalistically? Are there any aspects of human experience that might better be represented by a depiction of figures that are not naturalistic? And do you think realism is necessary for a work of art to be beautiful or successful? So there's a lot that we're dealing with here. Many traditions across the world, and we're just looking at just two examples here, do not value naturalism as being the supreme purpose of figural representation. And it's not an indication that the artists of those cultures are incapable of that. And I'll tell you, in the instance of these two cultures here, that is not the case. Artists are certainly sophisticated enough and understand the human body to create naturalistic images. They choose not to. It's not important to them to create realistic-looking images. So I'd like us to consider, and for you to consider in your notes, these questions about human experience that might be better translated into abstract form as opposed to naturalistic form, and use these two as points of reference while you do so. So after that, that's the end of our lecture for this week. We've taken an extremely quick and vast view of the human form over many centuries and a few different cultural traditions. It's a lot to absorb, and hopefully your author, Harrison, in the textbook, is helping to clarify some of these points as well. So thank you guys very much. Next week we'll be discussing space and spatial representation in the arts, so we'll certainly look forward to that. If you have any questions or concerns or need to contact me about anything, you can find my email on the Blackboard website. Please let me know if you're having any difficulties. Either myself or my teaching assistant can really get on that and try to solve things for you as quickly as possible. Thank you guys very much. I will talk at you next week.